Since the aim of this research is to critically reflect on habits of thought relating to scripting for agency and conceptualizations of self, and since habits of thought are carried and recapitulated in language, particular uses of language form part of the methodology. Having found myself in a position to think through the relations between concepts such as self, character, person, agent, or soul, terminology has in fact been a constant source of headache throughout this PhD project, particularly as their treatments by other scholars have turned out to vary considerably. I say this not in order to vent or shirk my theorist's responsibility, but rather to suggest that the very irksomeness of dealing with terminology in this project is itself symptomatic of a broader cultural ambiguity surrounding such terms. I will attempt to disambiguate them in my own way in chapters 5 and 6. In the meantime, I will sometimes resort to listing terms together as a strategy for calling to mind some of their common meanings without resting too long on any one of them. In some cases, I will begin to use certain terms in specific ways much earlier in the thesis, and I will therefore begin this section on methodology with some notes on my use of mechanistic language and the term character and the phrase mechanics of self before giving an overview of the self-estranging performance practice and the critically self-reflective approach characterizing the methodology more broadly. A quick note on the use of mechanistic language. Throughout the sources cited in the overview above, reflections on writing and selfhood are occasionally made using mechanistic language, as when Derrida writes that to write is to produce a mark that will constitute a kind of machine that is in turn productive. When Irving Goffman refers to the role of expressive equipment in the presentation of self, or when Foucault describes technologies of the self in his study of subject formation. This is a style that I will continue to adopt throughout this dissertation because mechanistic metaphors inherently steer me away from essentializing the self, which I must do if I'm to faithfully consider the possibility of scripting for agency. In particular, I will frequently refer to the terms the human being and character in ways that are specific to this thesis, and from now on I will take the human being to mean that thing which plays out character or character substratum. So if you're looking at me right now, I'm a human being because I'm that thing which is playing out the Katarina character right now. So that's what I'm referring to as a human being, almost the apparatus that can play out these behaviors that you're seeing right now. And I will take character to mean a system of memes which plays out across a human being that is embedded within a social milieu. So that's a very kind of technical definition, but again, if you're looking at me right now, character is almost like the Katarina script that this human being is playing out right now. That's the character that you're observing. By referring to character as a system of memes, I mean that it is a free-floating behavioral script capable of being transmitted between human beings. So this Katarina script that I'm talking about, that this human being that you're seeing is playing out right now, this script can be learnt by another human being. So other human beings can kind of take on aspects of my character. Character can transmit. People can be influenced by my behaviors and start acting like me or sounding like me. So my character is free floating in a way, and the human being is the apparatus that is running that free floating script. This sets the thesis up for thinking of the human being as a being of potential rather than essence. So I'm not essentially Katarina. or the human being that's sitting here is not essentially Katarina or this Katarina that you're seeing right now. It's a machine full of potential to be all sorts of characters. It's just playing this character for you right now. It's not essentially meant to behave like this. So this thesis will be thinking of the human being as a being of potential rather than essence, and this distinction will become increasingly important throughout, the distinction between being a being of potential rather than essence, that I'm essentially this way. So let's also talk about the use of the term character. Using the term character as a vehicle for which to think about the possibility of scripting for agency originated from my storyteller's quest to bring my fictional characters to life. But a closer look at its wider meanings later solidified its usage here as especially apt. The word character calls to mind a number of meanings which may appear to be different, but which this research tries to understand simultaneously. The characters involved in writing, such as the characters on my keyboard, that's one way we can think of the word character. We can also think of it as a quality or the tendency of something to be a certain way. And it's also used as a synonym for personality, the way an agent is or acts, including fictional characters. This list reflects the historical iterations that the English word character has gone through to arrive at a single notion suggesting something to do with both writing and agency. Originating from the ancient Greek karakter, which once meant stamping tool, the word later makes a metonymic jump and begins to refer to the marks made by such a tool. Later still, the word comes to take on the more abstract meanings of distinctive mark, distinguishing quality, and eventually personality. So personality is a kind of mark. Talking about distinguishing marks of this kind might remind us of the way in which each mark in a drawing seems to be planted there deliberately to give special qualities to the drawing overall. In this way, the characters from which it is made manage to give the drawing as a whole something like a personality. This is where scripting for agency comes in. The research focuses on the cognitive association revealed by this etymological root between writing, mark-making, and pattern on the one hand, and personality, agency, and subjectivity on the other. The research zooms out to assume the most abstract definition of character, a distinctive mark, which can then be applied to both scripts and agents as a means of tapping in to some of the features and mechanisms that the two might have in common. Such commonalities include a writing-reading mechanism. Character, whether it is a letter on my keyboard or a person's recognizable manner of being, is legible. It is made up of pattern and recognition, of writing and reading. Character, the observable dynamic by which agent legibility is performed and read, is inscribed within a common language, and it requires training in order to be read. So the writing in a book needs to be read for the cycle to be complete of what it's meant to do. And a personality also is kind of being put out there in the world to be read. So character implies a writing-reading mechanism that's useful to us here. There's also this feature of predictability. In order for character to be legible and thus recognizable, it must be relatively predictable. something self-same about it must return again and again for it to be recognized as that distinctive mark and not some other. The characteristic rush of an ocean wave towards the shore is only characteristic and even appears to have something like a personality because it returns again and again, and because I can recognize it in its return. Likewise, for you to recognize me as Katarina, I must behave in a relatively predictable way so that next time you run into me, you can reread me as Katarina and not someone else. Virality is another interesting feature that is brought up by the term character. In order for character to be able to return again and again, it must have a means by which it can reproduce or transmit itself. In the case of the ocean wave, repeatability is most often achieved by the returning winds, and the reason the winds even return to push the sea forward is because the wind itself is driven by the cyclical process of the Earth's rotation and the resultant uneven heating of its atmosphere. So waves are repeating because there's something cyclical about their generation in the first place. And in the case of human character, character is also repeated, but by means of contagion. So humans catch character and spread it again. Such cultural viruses are called memes, and human character is a system of memes. And another kind of feature of character is its ghostliness. There is something ghostly about character in the same way, actually, in which there is something ghostly about a pattern. For where exactly is the pattern located within the material components of which it is made? Again, a wave is a good analogy for this. Imagine a Mexican wave. The effect is impressive when, at a football match, a row of people stand up and sit down when their neighbour has done the same, and we watch the wave flutter across the stadium like a snake rushing through the seats. But where is the wave exactly? It is entirely produced by the act of people standing up and sitting down, but no individual person, nor the row as a whole, can be said to be the wave. The wave is an emergent property of the human beings that produce it, and so it is somehow dependent upon, but also eerily independent of the standing and sitting people. The same is true of a domino effect or an ocean wave. The wave, the pattern, is a ghostly, abstract property that seems to emerge from a substratum. Character, too, is a pattern that seems to emerge out of a collection of behaviours performed by an object or an agent. So I could wave my hands around and talk in a certain way, but none of my individual acts are my character. The character seems to emerge out of the sum of all these acts. And this ghostly independence, but also dependence of character in relation to its physical substratum is perhaps what is captured by the term soul. Something seems to be hovering above the human being that's playing out the character. Although the term character as it is used here may be defined as a distinctive mark or a recognizable pattern of any kind, really, this thesis focuses primarily on human character. That is, the set of characters that together form a grammar of human personality. And there are other kinds of character, such as the character of a line in a drawing. But I set human character as my focus for now because I claim that the performance practice described here can provide new tools for thinking about the mechanics of human self and by extension, that of the selves of our prospective spiritual relatives, general artificial intelligences. So character will prove to be rather multifaceted as we move through the thesis and refine our analogies, from thinking of character as a pattern, to a system of means, to a kind of software, to a frame, and finally an attractor in the space of possible behaviours. So we are going to revisit this idea of character lots and lots of times with lots of different comparisons to give you a renewed sort of feeling for what this thing might be. So let's talk about the mechanics of self, another kind of phrase that I keep coming back to in this work. Given the need to continually refer to research from such wide-ranging domains in this project, I propose the mechanics of self as the unifying term and the shared focal point for research devoted to an elementary study of self and its close relatives: agent, person, soul, spirit, subject, intelligence, being, etc., including attempts at re-evaluating and disambiguating these terms. Maybe it's worth also pointing out this footnote here, that in time readers may notice that I privilege the use of some of these terms over others in this thesis, particularly self, agent, and soul I prefer over subjectivity or consciousness, and I stick primarily to a behaviourist approach and focus on observable agent-like behaviour. As you can see right now on the screen, I'm performing agent-like behaviour that you can observe, but I do use the word soul. And soul is included in the discussion because, as I will talk about further later, ghostliness is an observable quality of emergent systems. So although the word ghost doesn't seem like it belongs to a scientific or mechanistic understanding of selfhood, I think it is actually a useful term, and hopefully ghosts and souls will become clearer concepts in this work and useful concepts. Research into the mechanics of self is concerned with the architecture of agency, focusing on testing, expanding, troubling, or elaborating some of the a priori assumptions about how self works, its shape, movement, plasticity, mechanism, and scope. It does not take for granted what self is made of, or the kind of material substratum upon which it might play out, and therefore potentially encompasses, in addition to humans and other biological candidates, prospective general artificial intelligence, extraterrestrial life, fictional characters, and other autonomous agents, which may share similar properties to those continually defined and revised by this field. The way in which self is modelled, imagined, and theorized at the level of its fundamental mechanics has consequences at higher levels of endeavour, such as the politics of identity, the ethics of social interaction, representational politics with respect to social diversity, and epistemological concerns about positionality, like what position you're speaking from when you're writing, for example. So although the politics of identity is given little direct consideration in this thesis, in favour of attending more deeply to questions of self-mechanics through performance practice, there is a related kind of politics active within this thesis that starts by acknowledging the intimate and interdependent relationship between the two levels of endeavour, this more fundamental attempt to understand agency and this higher level attempt to think about, for instance, things like the politics of identity. The mechanics of self is elementary to the politics of identity, just as physical mechanics is elementary to biology, with both levels of study being equally relevant and important modes of research. For example, rather than focusing on the lived experience of inhabiting specific identities in themselves, the mechanics of self asks how subject positions arise, or what kinds of assumptions belie the notion of positionality in the first place. And just as advances in physics occasionally come to the aid of biologists and vice versa, I embark on my performance experiments in character with the hope that attending to assumptions about self at the elementary or fundamental level can furnish the project for social justice carried out at a higher level with new critical tools that might aid this ongoing ethical work. The performance practice as a laboratory of the soul. The research methodology, which I'll talk about shortly in Chapter 1, is primarily comprised of a character performance practice centered on the empathetic inhabitation of alternative personas. The performances start with a process I call self-estrangement, in which I change aspects of my appearance, behavior, or environment. So I'm changing these characteristics in either obvious or subtle ways until those changes bring with them a cascade of associations and tip me into the temporary state of believing I am someone else, someone who looks like the new character I am at that moment presenting. Within this space of character play, I find I can plug theories on the mechanics of self into my performances and watch them play out on the surface of my own person. The performance practice has thus become a kind of laboratory of the soul, in which I have been able to use acting, improvising, and scripting character in order to flex my intuitions about my own self and its mechanics. In the budding era of artificial intelligence, a character role-playing, oral storytelling practice such as this may seem a surprisingly ancient technology to consult on the question of scripting for agency. When observing the magical capabilities of the latest generative AIs like OpenAI's ChatGPT, explanations of its power often place the emphasis on the AI technology itself. The learning algorithm or the supercomputer required for its training. However, the real power of large language models like GPT stems from a much older technology, language itself. It is precisely the shared cultural context encoded into language and its role in subject formation that is what brings artificial intelligence, fictional character, and human character into the same realm. Character is exchanged freely between all three categories of agents. And through my performance practice, I am able to manipulate the same materials that would endow any kind of agent, artificial or organic, fictional or real, with character. And that's really the key. So that's outlined briefly here, and we're going to delve into this way of using performance to ask research questions later. And then a note on critical self-reflection. I approach the research not only as the character or characters that bear the author's name, the social agent Katarina, but as an ecology of characters comprised of her and all the nameless interlocutors that appear in the performances. And I take advantage of the diversity of perspectives that they afford me. Chapter 5 is an example of a moment where a character adopted in a state of performance took the reins of the research and steered it in a direction that I, in my habitual character, never would have anticipated. Related to this, self-estrangement intentionally borrows its terminology from Bertolt Brecht's concept of estrangement in theatre making, as it serves as a device for entering into a critical engagement with the object of study, in this case, the self. More broadly, in both the dissertation writing and performance practice, this thesis takes a critically self-reflective approach, And critical self-reflection is a methodology that sustains a line of meta-level questioning about the researcher's own assumptions regarding their role and what they are doing throughout the process of researching itself. And it involves becoming aware of one's presuppositions and challenging the sources, nature, and consequences of our habits of mind. In addition to the self-estranging performance practice, this approach is present in parallel attempts to self-consciously reflect and report on the research process throughout the thesis and in various forms, such as the experimental dialogue in 2 characters in section 5.1, and the analyses of failures and unintended biases in my own works of art or scholarship that come on later as well, or the performative account on becoming a research character in the prologue. In all of these cases, it was necessary to initiate the making strange of the research, to kind of occasionally step outside of it, to peer back into it. Okay, and so here is a note on the performance experiments. So all the theory I'm going to take you through regarding agency and character arised out of running experiments in this laboratory of the soul that I call my art practice. So here's a brief description of these experiments, and we will encounter them in more depth, of course. Particularly instrumental to arriving at my findings were 4 performance experiments and 1 drawing experiment. 4 of these experiments are written up as detailed reports linked throughout this thesis, with the 5th being the most significant, described in the main body, and it's called Politics of Inner Self. Okay, so the first experiment associated with this thesis, self-estrangement methodology exchange, involved attempting to teach 5 participants how to adopt my performance method and run performance experiments for themselves. The second experiment associated with this thesis was called Introspective Performance Experiment, and it involved creating 7 recordings of myself adopting alternative characters while introspecting on the process and orally reporting on any reflections that came up, thus opening up the performance method to retrospective analysis. So this was an experiment in which I was actually trying to analyze my own method of changing character. The third experiment associated with this thesis, diagramming the self, deriving lay theories of selfhood from drawings, involved asking 104 participants to diagram the self in order to analyze the resulting drawings for implied lay theories about the mechanics of self. The fourth experiment associated with this thesis, Thought Shift Performance Experiment, involved creating 8 hour-long recordings of myself going into character, with a focus on exploring how a deep focus on character empathy alone, so I'm just focusing on imagining I'm somebody else, without thinking about what I'm saying, the story this character is telling, influenced what I ended up saying and doing. So I'm looking at how adopting a different character had the potential to shift how I thought. So that was that experiment. And the 5th experiment associated with this thesis, Politics of Inner Self, involved making a video recording of myself alternately adopting 2 different characters and staging a spontaneous conversation between them. The dissertation and the experimental reports linked to it are quite distinct in that the former has a theoretical character, while the latter is empirical. Although these experiments have been relegated to online links, in practice I do not privilege the theoretical work I have undertaken over the empirical, and I could easily imagine another version of this thesis with flipped priorities, empirical process and results in the main body, and the theoretical papers linked. On this particular occasion, however, as a means of managing aspiration against contingencies and scope against scale, I've arrived at the current order of priorities in reference to the fact that since my performance practice itself draws on the diverse disciplines of self-mechanics, I would in turn like to make my own theoretical contribution available and applicable to diverse endeavours beyond the arts, while still making available the specific processes and evidence gathered in the online experimental reports. In any case, it is likely that the empirical work undertaken will form the main part of future work. A note on character choice. At this point, I would like to explain why the thesis will treat the specific choice of character in the performance works as relatively arbitrary within the narrow scope of this particular research, when it is not arbitrary in my performance practice more broadly. There is, of course, a great deal that could be said about why certain characters interest me over others, but this would be beyond the scope of the aims of this particular thesis. So here I am specifically considering the creative potential in mobilizing the effects of character switching brought about by performance, and tracking the insights into self-mechanics that such deliberate frame switching practice can yield. So to that end, the focus here is on the switching between characters itself and the difference it makes to my authorship, rather than the specific kinds of characters I gravitate to when I switch. A whole other thesis could be written on the way in which character choice in a practice like mine contributes, wittingly or unwittingly, to a politics of representation, sometimes reproducing, sometimes deviating from cultural stereotypes across innumerable dimensions, including familiar ones such as gender, class, and ethnicity, but also many more, as yet unrecognized classes of human generalization. Indeed, giving more thought to my criteria when choosing which kinds of characters to study and perform will probably be the focus of my work after this PhD. Nevertheless, while the exploration of character within the privacy of my practice is decidedly experimental, in the sense that I often do not know where I will end up when I begin improvising a departure from my habitual character, I do exercise political agency when I select which of my performances will go out into the world as works of video art. An example of this is the way in which the performance video works frequently introduce contradictions to expected behaviours within certain stereotypical characterizations. There is, for example, the revolutionary leader who trades in anti-establishment zeal for commercialized self-care by abandoning her post-revolution leadership role in favor of a beach holiday. So that's in that piece that I've renamed Revolutionary. Or there is the feminist who inadvertently finds herself reproducing the stereotypical duties of a suburban housewife, cooking, wearing an apron, observing her male partner mowing the lawn, wondering if playing out the stereotypical role whilst mindful of its power as a social script in any way liberates her from its gender determinism all the same. Here I'm thinking about suburbia. Performing at the brink of a stereotypical representation, first deviating from it, then returning to it, might even provide the audience with a direct way of questioning such expectations of behaviour and thinking through them in the vicinity of the artwork. Furthermore, later I will claim that working with stereotypes to produce artworks forged out of a palette of characters is a consequence of the very social purpose of character and why it exists. Working with stereotypes as a consequence of working with character is in part due to the fact that human beings must labour to generalize themselves, to place themselves within stereotypical categories in order to be part of a social system. This notion of character as a tool for communication and social cooperation that comes with a complicated mix of costs and benefits to the individual, including self-generalization, is a notion that will be explored in Chapter 6. It is my hope that an artistic practice which takes these generalizations and stereotypes as its principal medium and plays with the language of character might go some way to rendering the costs and benefits to self-generalization within character management visible, intuitive, and open to question.